They laughed at the scruffy single dad in the luxury mall until the owner walked in and saluted him. The most expensive store in the mall. The little girl froze at the entrance, looked down at her small floral dress, then up at the gold-lit interior of Lumiere like she was standing at the edge of something she wasn't allowed to cross. Her father squeezed her hand. They walked in. Faded t-shirt, wrinkled khakis, uncombed hair. The staff saw him in 3 seconds flat. Brandon Reed, store manager, navy blazer, walked over with the voice he saved for situations like this. "Sir," a beat. "I'm not sure this store is the right fit for your budget." Someone laughed. The little girl's chin dropped. Her knuckles went pale around her father's hand. Then the glass door opened again. Victor Hayes, general manager of the entire Cole Holdings property, stopped mid-step, stared, and the color drained from his face. Because he knew that man. He'd seen that face in a room where no one spoke until he spoke first. Victor's hand pressed flat against his chest. He walked straight past Brandon Reed, stopped in front of the man in the faded t-shirt, and bowed his head. 5 minutes before they walked in. A parking garage on the 3rd level of Cole Holdings Mall, downtown, Tuesday. The kind of weekday that doesn't ask anything of anyone. Ethan cut the engine. He didn't get out. The parking garage was dim and smelled like concrete and exhaust, the kind of smell that exists everywhere and nowhere that you stop noticing after 30 seconds. He sat with both hands still on the wheel and looked into the rearview mirror. Sophie was working on her hair ribbon. She'd been working on it for 4 minutes. She would get it almost right, then pull it loose and start again. Her small fingers moved with the focused, private seriousness of a child who has decided that this one thing, this ribbon, this bow, this small act of preparation, is the thing she can control. Ethan watched her and didn't say anything. The ribbon was pale yellow. Her dress was white with small blue flowers, slightly snug across the shoulders now, the hem sitting an inch higher than it did last spring. His wife had picked it out. He remembered the afternoon clearly, a Saturday, a small shop on Devereux Street, Sophie spinning once in front of the mirror and saying, "It has flowers, Mama, look, it has flowers." Maya had laughed and said, "Yes, I see them. I see every single one." That was 3 years ago. Sophie didn't know he still remembered exactly which shop. "Hey," he said. She looked up in the mirror. The ribbon was still unfinished, one end hanging loose. "Where do you want to go first?" She thought about it with the care she brought to everything, fully, without rushing, as if the question deserved more than a quick answer. "The nice one," she said. "The one with the gold lights. Lumiere. Is that how you say it?" "That's how you say it." She nodded, storing it away. Then looked back down at her ribbon. Her hand slowed. "Dad." She didn't look up. "Do you think they'll look at us weird?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He didn't reach for a reassuring answer. He didn't tell her no, of course not. Everyone's welcome everywhere. Because she was 9 years old, and 9-year-olds know when they're being managed. She had been reading rooms since she was 6. Since the year she learned that some silences meant her mother wasn't coming back. "Maybe," he said. "Some of them might." Sophie's hands went still. "But we're not going in for them," he said. "We're going in for you." She was quiet. Her fingers found the loose end of the ribbon again. "You're wearing that shirt," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. The way she said things that were true. Ethan glanced down at his shirt. Faded gray, washed too many times. The collar slightly uneven on the left side. He'd put it on that morning without thinking, the same way he'd put on every shirt for the past 4 years. Reaching into the drawer in the dark, pulling out whatever his hand found, because the energy required to care about clothing was energy he'd learned to redirect. He looked at the shirt for a moment. Then he looked back up at Sophie in the mirror. "I know," he said. He didn't change it. He opened his door and stepped out and walked around to her side and held out his hand. She took it, her small fingers finding his, and he felt the slight tug as she pulled herself out of the seat. "It's your birthday," he said. "Nobody gets to make you feel small today." Sophie looked up at him on the ramp of the parking garage, the faint sound of the mall's ventilation system humming somewhere above them, the distant murmur of the crowd beyond the entrance doors. She didn't say anything, but she kept hold of his hand, and they walked in. Inside Lumiere, corner position, the best real estate in the building, foot traffic from both main corridors. The store had been renovated 14 months ago. New lighting rig, Italian marble flooring, a sound system that cost more than the annual salary of every sales associate working the floor. Not unpleasant cold, designed cold. The kind that signals you've crossed a threshold, that the air inside is different from the air outside, that this is a curated environment and your body should register that immediately. Lumiere kept its temperature at 68 degrees year-round. Ethan knew this because it was in the renovation proposal he'd approved 14 months ago. He didn't mention that to Sophie. She moved in beside him and paused for just a moment, the brief absorption of a child processing a new space, her eyes traveling slowly around the room. Gold lighting from recessed fixtures, glass shelving with single items displayed like artifacts. A woman at the far counter with her back straight and her expression arranged into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. Sophie's grip tightened slightly on his hand. Ethan kept walking. 3 staff members were visible on the floor. A young woman near the accessories wall, Jade, her name tag read, dark-haired, early 20s, straightening something that didn't need straightening. A man in a pale blue shirt near the fitting rooms, tablet in hand. And Brandon Reed, standing near the central display in a navy blazer that fit him well, with a particular posture of someone who has learned that standing slightly apart from everyone else reads as authority. All 3 of them clocked Ethan within 4 seconds of his walking in. None of them moved. There was no dramatic pause. No exchanged glances, no pointed hesitation. It was smoother than that, and therefore worse. It was the absence of motion. The simple, practiced, non-responsive people who have learned to read a room and act accordingly, who have decided in under 3 seconds that this particular customer did not require their attention. Sophie noticed. Ethan felt her noticing, felt it in the slight change of her grip, the way her steps became a fraction more careful, as if she were trying to take up less floor space. Brandon Reed waited 10 seconds. Then he moved. He crossed the floor with the unhurried confidence of someone performing a task he's performed many times, and stopped at a distance that was technically polite and practically designed to block further entry into the store without appearing to do so. "Sir," his voice was warm. Professionally warm, the warmth of something manufactured and maintained. "I want to make sure we're set up for success here." A brief pause, calibrated. "I'm not entirely sure this is the right fit for your—" He let the word sit for just a beat too long. "Budget. We have some wonderful options on the second level that might be more— Today is my daughter's birthday." Brandon stopped. Ethan's voice hadn't changed. It was the same quiet, even tone he'd used to answer Sophie in the car. No edge, no performance. Just a sentence, placed down in the space between them, like something that didn't need to be argued about. "I want to see your best." 2 customers near the accessories wall had turned. A woman in a cream coat was watching from the side of her eye, pretending not to. Jade, still at the accessories wall, made a small sound, low and brief, that carried farther than she intended. Sophie's chin dropped toward her chest. The movement was small and total. Her head went down and her shoulders came forward half an inch, and she became, very suddenly, a child trying to be smaller than she was. Ethan saw it. Something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not visible, not dramatic, just a change in the quality of stillness in him, the kind of thing that doesn't register on a face, but changes everything about a person's weight in a room. He didn't look away from Brandon. He was still looking at Brandon when, from the edge of his vision, a young woman in a dark store uniform stopped walking. She had been crossing the floor toward the stockroom. She stopped. She looked at Sophie, then she changed direction. "Hi." Her voice was different from Brandon's, not performing warmth, just warm. "Can I help you find something?" Her name tag said Emily. East wall of the store. Emily Carter had worked at Lumiere for 2 years and 4 months. She was 26 years old, had a degree in design from Harwich College, and had been ranked last in floor sales for 3 consecutive months because she spent too long with customers who didn't convert. This was a fact Brandon had cited in her last 2 performance reviews. She had looked at her numbers in her car on a Tuesday morning 4 weeks ago and sat very still for several minutes before going in. Emily led them to the accessories wall without making it feel like she was leading them anywhere. She just walked and talked and asked Sophie questions. Not the questions adults usually ask children, the performed questions, the "how old are you" and "what grade are you in," designed to demonstrate interest rather than to express it. She asked Sophie which color she thought looked better under gold light versus white light, and whether she thought a bag should match an outfit or contrast it. And Sophie, who had been quiet and shoulder forward since the moment they walked in, looked up and actually thought about it. "Contrast," Sophie said, with a seriousness that almost made Emily smile. "Otherwise, it just disappears." "That's exactly right," Emily said, and she meant it. She crouched down in front of the accessories display, not bending at the waist the way adults do when they're performing attentiveness while remaining fundamentally upright, but actually crouching, knees bent, eye to eye, and began explaining the items as she would have explained them to anyone she respected. The pale pink bag near the center of the display. Italian leather, she said, sealed with something called a blind stitch, which meant the seam was folded inward so you couldn't see it from outside. She showed Sophie the inside of the zipper pull, the tiny engraved mark that meant it was made by hand. Sophie leaned in. "Does it come in other colors?" she asked. "3, but this one." Emily turned it slightly under the light. "This one does something the others don't. See how the color changes a little depending on the angle?" Sophie turned her head, left, then right. "Oh," she breathed. Ethan stood back and watched. He had learned, in the years since Maya died, to read a room through Sophie's body. When her shoulders stayed forward, he stayed present, ready to redirect. When they dropped, when she forgot to be careful and leaned in and became fully herself, he allowed himself briefly to step back. Her shoulders were dropping now. He watched Emily showing Sophie the blind stitch, and something in his chest settled very slightly, like a door that had been slightly ajar moving to rest. He was still watching when Sophie looked up at Emily and asked, in a voice so quiet it was almost just breath, "Do you think we should have come here?" Emily didn't move for a moment. Not the surprised motionlessness of someone caught off guard, more the deliberate pause of someone who has understood the real weight of a question and is choosing not to treat it lightly. Her eyes found Sophie's face and stayed there. "You have a birthday today," she said. "That means you get to be exactly wherever you want to be." Sophie held her gaze. Then, slowly, she looked down at the pale pink bag. Ethan looked away. He looked at a point on the marble floor between his feet. His jaw was doing something complicated that he was working to keep off his face. It lasted exactly as long as it was allowed to. The floor, same moment. The VIP entrance, a discreet side door near the fragrance counter, opened for the first time that afternoon. The change in the room was immediate. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced. But Ethan had spent enough years in enough rooms to feel the shift in attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not with your ears, but with something older than that. Every staff member on the floor reoriented slightly. The woman at the far counter straightened. The man with the tablet moved toward the fragrance section. Brandon Reed turned from where he was standing and began walking toward the entrance with the smooth, accelerated purpose of someone who has just remembered what his job actually is. Jade appeared at Emily's shoulder. "Hey." Her voice was low. "VIP. Brandon needs floor coverage." A brief glance at Ethan, then back at Emily. "You should go." Emily didn't turn around. "I have a customer," she said. Jade made a small sound, the sound of someone who has decided that another person's choices are that person's problem. "Your numbers are already the lowest on the floor this month. Just think about it." She pushed off and moved toward the entrance. Sophie had been watching the exchange in the way that children watch adult conversations, tracking not the words but the emotional weather beneath them, understanding more than anyone intended her to. She set the bag down, quietly, carefully. Her hands placed it back on the shelf with the deliberate precision of someone returning something that was never quite theirs to hold. Ethan saw her do it. His eyes moved from Sophie's hands to Sophie's face, and something moved across his expression and was gone in under a second. Something that would have been invisible to almost everyone in the room. Then Brandon Reed was back. He'd handed the VIP client to the woman at the far counter, efficient, practiced, and now he was here, and his patience, which had been a professional construction from the beginning, had thinned to something that no longer bothered to look like patience. He stopped near Emily's shoulder. "Emily." Not loud, but not quiet either. Pitched in that particular register that everyone within 8 feet can hear clearly while maintaining the plausibility of a private conversation. "You are wasting floor time. I need you on actual sales." Emily turned to face him. Her expression was quiet, not defiant, quieter than defiance, and therefore more difficult to argue with. "He's a customer who came in with a question," she said. "I'm answering it." That's a very generous interpretation of the situation. It's an accurate one. Brandon looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not cruelty exactly, more the particular exhaustion of a man who is being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. He'd had 3 emails this week about Q3 numbers and 1 phone call from regional management that had left him with a headache that hadn't fully cleared. He was not, in this moment, performing contempt for someone else's dignity. He was genuinely overwhelmed, and genuinely certain that Emily was making both their days harder than they needed to be. That didn't make what he said next acceptable, but it made him something more complicated than a villain. He turned slightly toward the floor, not quite at anyone, not quite away from everyone, and said in a tone that belonged to no one in particular and therefore reached everyone in earshot, "I'm carrying this quarter on my back, and I've got people on my floor who can't read a room." Somewhere behind him, a brief sound. A customer. Almost a laugh. Sophie heard it. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Both hands came together in front of her, fingers laced. The posture of a child making herself very still, very contained, waiting for something unpleasant to be over. Ethan watched his daughter's hands fold together. He took 1 step forward. His mouth was opening, and something had changed in the set of his shoulders. Something that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the 4 years he'd spent being the only person standing between his daughter and the version of the world that did not account for her. And then, at the edge of his peripheral vision, a man he almost recognized walked through the front entrance of Lumiere, stopped 3 feet inside the door, and stood very still, looking directly at him. The entrance of Lumiere. Victor Hayes had been the general manager of Cole Holdings' downtown flagship property for 7 years. He had walked this inspection route every Tuesday for 6 of those 7 years. Same order, same pace, same clipboard he kept meaning to replace with a tablet and never did. He knew every square foot of this building. He had never, in 7 years, stopped mid-route. Victor stood at the entrance of Lumiere and did not move. He had been 3 steps past the glass front when something made him stop. Not a sound, not a movement, something pattern-based, the way the mind sometimes recognizes a shape before the eye has finished looking at it, a flag thrown up from somewhere below conscious thought that said, "Wait." Look again. He had looked again. The man standing near the accessories wall had his hands at his sides, his posture set in a particular way that Victor found himself searching for a word to describe. Surveying. Not watching the way a parent watches. Watching the way someone watches when they're building a complete picture, when they're tracking multiple things simultaneously, when they're not just present in a space, but cataloging it. Victor knew that posture. He'd seen it once before. A conference room in March of last year, the annual leadership summit for all Cole Holdings property managers. 43 people around a table, every VP, every regional director. A man at the far end of the table who had not said a single word for the first 90 minutes of the meeting, and then said 4 sentences, quietly, without raising his voice. And every other person in the room had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with meeting etiquette. Victor had leaned over to the VP beside him afterward and said, "Who was that?" And the VP had looked at him with an expression of genuine surprise and said, "That's Ethan Cole." He'd found a photograph later, pulled from an industry event file. The company kept records of that kind of thing. A contract signing years back. Clear shot of the man's hands around a pen, and across the second knuckle of the left index finger, catching the light at a particular angle. A small scar, pale and thin. Victor's eyes went to the man's left hand. It was resting against the accessory shelf. The gold lighting of Lumiere was doing exactly what the flash of that old photograph had done. The scar was there. Victor's clipboard came down slowly from his arm. He was not entirely aware of doing it. Cole Holdings had 53 properties across 11 cities. The chairman did not attend ribbon cuttings. He did not send letters. He did not appear on the company's public-facing website. He existed for most people who worked inside the organization as a name on a document and a signature on a policy brief. Victor had managed this property for 7 years and had never once been in the same room as the man. He was in the same room as the man, in a faded gray t-shirt, standing in a store he owned with a little girl in a dress that was slightly too small, watching a member of his own staff get humiliated by a floor manager who had no idea. Victor straightened, took a breath, set his clipboard under his arm. The floor manager was speaking again. Victor could hear the register of it from the entrance. That particular pitch, professionally plausible, designed to carry. He watched the little girl's hands come together in front of her, fingers laced. He watched the man in the gray shirt take one step forward. Victor pushed through the door. The floor of Lumiere. The moment that follows. Victor Hayes did not run. He walked at a pace that was not quite his usual pace. Slightly faster, though he would not have described it that way. The marble floor was very smooth, and his shoes made almost no sound on it, and he had the odd, brief sensation of moving through the room the way a current moves through water, displacing everything in its path without being visible. He reached the accessories wall in 11 seconds. Brandon Reed was still speaking. Victor put his hand on Brandon's arm, not firmly, not with any pressure, just contact. The same gesture he might use to get someone's attention at a crowded table. Brandon stopped mid-sentence and turned, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling into something professionally neutral. Victor. Surprise in the voice, controlled. "I didn't see you come in." "No," Victor said. He looked at Brandon for a moment. His voice was very even. "Could you give us a minute?" It wasn't a question. Brandon knew it wasn't a question. His eyes moved briefly to Ethan, and something crossed his face, some beginning of calculation, and then he nodded once and moved away toward the far counter. Victor turned. He had rehearsed nothing. He had had approximately 11 seconds to prepare for this moment, and had used all of them to cross a room, which meant he was now standing in front of the chairman of Cole Holdings with no plan whatsoever, which was not a situation he had ever anticipated being in. He did the only thing that seemed appropriate. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I'm Victor Hayes. I manage this property." Ethan looked at him. His expression gave away nothing. Not surprise, not displeasure, not the particular performance of graciousness that powerful people sometimes deploy when a subordinate has witnessed something inconvenient. He just looked at Victor with the same quality of attention he'd been using to watch the room, and Victor had the sudden, unsettling impression that the man had known exactly who he was the moment he walked through the door. "I know who you are," Ethan said. Victor absorbed that. "Then you know," he said carefully, "that what just happened." He paused, choosing his words with more deliberateness than he usually applied to anything, "is not what this property is." Ethan's attention moved. It moved past Victor, to his left, to Sophie, who was standing with her hands still laced together in front of her, looking at the pale pink bag on the shelf. Not picking it up, just looking at it, with an expression that Victor could not fully read, but that made something in his chest contract in a way he hadn't expected. "Sophie," Ethan said. She looked up. "This is Mr. Hayes. He runs the building." Sophie looked at Victor with the careful, assessing attention of a child who has spent several years learning that not all adults are safe to trust, and who makes this determination quickly and accurately. Victor crouched down, not all the way. He was 51 years old and his knees were not what they had been, but enough to bring himself closer to her level. "Happy birthday," he said. Sophie held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the bag on the shelf. Her voice was very quiet. "Is it true that the color changes?" she asked. "Depending on how you look at it?" Victor blinked. He looked at the bag, then at the young woman in the dark uniform, Emily, who was standing a half-step back, her face carefully neutral except for her eyes, which were not neutral at all. "I'll tell you what," Victor said. "Why don't you ask the person who told you? Because she'd know better than I would." Sophie looked at Emily. Emily looked at Sophie. "Yes," Emily said, "it's true." She reached out and turned the bag slightly under the nearest light. "See?" Sophie watched the color shift, that subtle oyster pink gradient that moved between rose and cream depending on the angle, the quality that made this particular bag worth what it cost. "Oh," Sophie said, for the second time, but different this time. Not just wonder. Something quieter than that. Something that had to do with a question having been answered by someone who didn't have to answer it, who had chosen to answer it anyway. Victor straightened, slowly and with more difficulty than he would have liked, and turned to face Ethan. Ethan was watching his daughter, not watching Victor, not watching the room, not performing the composure of a man whose morning had gone a particular way, just watching Sophie's face as she looked at the bag, with an expression on his own face that Victor could only think to describe as the look of a person who is paying very close attention to something they want very much not to forget. Victor gave him a moment. Then, quietly, "Can I?" He stopped, reconsidered. "I'd like to have Emily take care of you today, for the rest of your visit," he paused, "however long you'd like to stay." Ethan's eyes moved to him. "That's Emily's call," he said. Victor looked at Emily. Emily looked at Sophie, who was still turned toward the bag, one finger hovering just above the leather without quite touching it, as though she wasn't sure she'd been given permission. "We're not done yet," Emily said. "Are we?" Sophie looked up at her, and for the first time since the parking garage, since the ribbon and the question about whether people would look at them weird, since the moment her chin had dropped to her chest in front of a room full of strangers, Sophie smiled. Small. Real. The kind that happens before a person decides to smile. "We're not done," she said. Ethan looked at the marble floor for a moment. Then he looked up. He didn't say anything to Victor. There was perhaps nothing that needed to be said, nothing that the situation hadn't already said on its own. But he did look at him, directly, and without any performance of gratitude or acknowledgement, and give a single, small nod. Victor received it. He turned and walked back toward the entrance, his clipboard under his arm, his footsteps nearly silent on the marble. At the door, he did not look back. But he stopped for a moment, his hand on the glass. In 14 months since the renovation, he had walked past the front of Lumiere approximately 300 times. He had looked through that glass at the gold lighting and the marble floor and the careful architecture of exclusion. Designed by a firm he'd approved, built on a brief he'd signed, and never once fully understood what he was looking at. He understood it now. He pushed through the door and walked back out into the corridor in the direction of the stairs and did not look at his clipboard once. The accessories wall. Late afternoon, the store has thinned out. The light through the front windows has shifted from white to gold. Emily and Sophie spent 42 minutes at the accessories wall. Ethan stood back and let them. He'd found a spot near the far edge of the section, one of those small, artfully placed stools that exist in high-end stores for the theoretical comfort of customers, but are primarily decorative. And he sat on it, because his feet hurt, and because standing in the middle of Lumiere for 40 minutes would have made him conspicuous in a way that sitting made him not, and because from this vantage point he could watch Sophie without her feeling watched. She had picked up the bag again within 2 minutes of Victor's departure, not tentatively this time. With both hands, turning it the way Emily had shown her, tracking the color shift, asking questions in the focused, slightly rapid-fire way she asked questions when something had genuinely interested her. Emily answered every one. Not with the compressed, simplified answers adults sometimes give children to satisfy them without engaging. Actually engaging. Pulling out a second bag to compare the leather finish, explaining the difference between a gold tone and a brass tone hardware with the specificity of someone who had thought about it, who cared about the distinction. Sophie absorbed everything. Ethan watched his daughter absorb everything and thought about the parking garage and the ribbon and the question she'd asked him in the rearview mirror. "Do you think they'll look at us weird?" He'd answered honestly. He always answered honestly, even when it would have been easier not to, because she had learned by the time she was 7 that the world contained people who would look at them weird, and the adults who pretended otherwise were lying. And he had decided when Maya died that the one thing he could reliably give her was a parent who didn't lie. He'd said, maybe. He hadn't said, and if they do, I will burn the building down around their ears. He hadn't needed to. She'd kept hold of his hand. He watched Emily explain something about the stitching on the strap, some detail about the way the thread was doubled on the inside curve to prevent fraying, and watched Sophie tilt her head exactly the way she tilted her head when she was filing information she intended to keep. And something in his chest did the thing it did sometimes, in moments like this one, when Sophie was just being Sophie without apology or reduction, a tightening that was not quite pain and not quite gratitude. Both. The two emotions that had become, over 4 years, almost indistinguishable from each other. He thought about Maya, not the absence of her, the way he usually thought about her, not the shape her presence used to take in a room, and no longer did. He thought about the shop on Devereux Street and the white dress with the small blue flowers, and the way Maya had laughed and said, I see them, I see every single one. He thought about how Sophie had laughed too, spinning once in front of the mirror, and how the sound of it had bounced off the walls of that small shop, and how he had stood in the doorway watching and thought, with the specific, unguarded certainty that good moments produce. Remember this. Don't forget this. He hadn't forgotten. He would not forget this either. Emily was helping Sophie try the bag on, the short strap over her shoulder, the longer strap adjusted for her height. And Sophie was looking at her reflection in the small mirror on the accessory shelf, her expression doing the complicated thing that 9-year-olds' expressions do when they are seeing themselves as they would like to be seen and are not yet sure they're allowed to. It fits, Emily said. Sophie looked at her own reflection. It does, she said. Ethan paid at the counter. He used the matte black card, the one without logos, the one that most people wouldn't recognize. The associate at the register, a young man, mid-20s, who had been watching the afternoon unfold with the expression of someone recalibrating something significant, took it without a word and processed the transaction with the careful efficiency of a person who has understood, without being told, that this is a moment requiring competence and not commentary. Brandon Reed was not at the counter. He had remained visible on the floor, at the far end of the store near the fitting rooms, with the posture of a man conducting himself with professionalism while privately hoping that the hour would end. But he had not reappeared near the accessory section, and Ethan had not looked for him. Emily walked them to the door, not because it was policy, because she wanted to. At the threshold, that boundary between the design cold of Lumiere and the warmer ambient air of the corridor, Sophie stopped and looked up at Emily. Thank you, she said, for the blind stitch. Emily looked at her. Happy birthday, Sophie, she said. Sophie nodded once, the way she nodded when she meant something and didn't have more words for it. Then she looked up at Ethan, and he could see on her face, clearly, unmistakably, that the question she'd asked him in the parking garage had been answered in a way that would stick. They stepped through the door. Ethan walked 2 steps down the corridor, then stopped. He turned back. Emily was still at the threshold, watching them go in the way that people sometimes watch things they know they won't see again. He looked at her for a moment. You should know, he said, that you're very good at this." Emily absorbed that. Her expression did something complicated. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true, and she had learned, over 2 years and 4 months of being ranked last, that the things that were true deserved to be said, so is she. Ethan looked at his daughter. Sophie was already turned toward the corridor, the pale pink bag on her shoulder, looking at the next store down, a bakery, by the smell of it, warm and certain, the kind of smell that doesn't need to be designed. "Yeah," he said, "she is." He held out his hand, she took it, and they walked on. Sometimes the most powerful people in the room look nothing like what we expect. No tailored suit, no polished shoes, no signal that says, "I matter," because they never needed one. That little girl felt it before anyone else did. The weight of a room deciding she didn't belong. The quiet cruelty of a laugh she didn't earn. She gripped her father's hand tighter, not because she was afraid of the store, but because she was learning, right then, what the world sometimes does to people who don't look the part. But her father never flinched. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not about wealth, not about status, but about the kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are when no one else does. The ones who bow their heads at the end of the story aren't always bowing to power. Sometimes they're bowing to dignity they almost missed. If this story stayed with you even a little, drop a word in the comments. Just one. Whatever you felt. We read every single one, and honestly, your words are why we keep making these. Like, if you believe quiet dignity is its own kind of strength. Subscribe if you want more stories that actually mean something. Thank you for watching.